think it was junior, maybe senior year of college, when I first heard someone utter the title of Consider the Lobster. It was amongst the titterings of those who ran in more sophisticated circles than I did, and I would have been showing my ignorance by asking what kind of story such a bizarre title belonged to. All I could glean was that it was by an author who'd written a book I'd never read, but was supposed to regard as he went by 3 names, which gave him an air of credibility. Even though this incident and the manuscript preceded the film The Lobster by about a decade, I recall already having assumed that type of premise. Story in the vein of Thomas Pynchon or James Joyce, a narrative operating primarily to deliver rhythmic prose and dreamlike metaphor, with nary a toe dipped into the realm of literalism. I didn't really have anything to base this on except for the tweeness of the title and the typical taste of those who I'd first eavesdropped circulating it. With finals around the corner and nothing more tangible to lure me into procrastination, I stuffed The Lobster into the sock drawer of my mind and studied more pressing material. It wasn't until earlier this year, out of sheer happenstance, that I once again overheard someone bring up the title of Consider the Lobster. And seeing as how finals week is no longer but a distant memory, I decided to actually sit down and read the damn thing. The first of 3 Eureka-esque mental interjections came about halfway through the first sentence. Wait, no, really, it's literally just about lobsters? After I finished reading the essay in a single sitting, the second thought came as, where did the last hour of my life go? If you aren't familiar yet with the contents of Consider the Lobster, as I wasn't, now's probably a good time for a quick rundown. Consider the Lobster is a journalistic essay written by David Foster Wallace and was first published in the December 2004 issue of Gourmet magazine. It isn't exactly gonzo journalism, but it's definitely closer in spirit to Hunter S. Thompson than to Wolf Blitzer. The essay is described and does begin as a review of the 2003 Maine Lobster Festival. In actuality, the writer seems largely disinterested in appraising the Lobster Festival on its own terms, demonstrating an attitude somewhere between apathy and derision towards the festival's promotional materials and its organizers. Once Wallace has completely lost interest in just rotely describing the festival, the second section of the essay pivots slowly into discussing the cultural norms surrounding the eating of lobster, and then, naturally, into the crustacean's preparation. The meat of the essay, if you'll pardon the pun, concerns the ethics thereof.
So then here is a question that's all but unavoidable at the world's largest lobster cooker, and may arise in kitchens across the U.S. Is it all right to boil a sentient creature alive just for our gustatory pleasure? A related set of concerns. Is the previous question irksomely PC or sentimental? What does all right even mean in this context? Is the whole thing just a matter of personal choice?
Wallace goes down a list of common talking points that are in favor of boiling, or at least defend the practice as being similarly humane as other forms of industrialized animal killing for the purpose of harvesting meat. And now here's where it starts to get really interesting, because Wallace's incredulity is obvious just from the tone of the piece, but he doesn't seem keen on outright debunking the claims. Rather, he's trying to throw a monkey wrench into the unquestioned status of these views, whereupon Consider the Lobster evolves into its final form, that being a series of ethical and existential questions posed directly to the reading audience, asking them, you, the reader, presumably the reader of Gourmet magazine, yes, but also whomsoever should just happen to have picked up this essay outside of its original publication. It asks you, the reader, to consider what the ethical consumption of our fellow animals truly means. It asks you to consider the lobster.
The truth is that if you, the festival attendee, permit yourself to think that lobsters can suffer and would rather not, the MLF begins to take on the aspect of something like a Roman circus or medieval torture fest. Does that comparison seem a bit much? If so, exactly why? Or what about this one? Is it possible that future generations will regard our present agribusiness and eating practices in much the same way we now view Nero's entertainments or Mengele's experiments? These last few queries, though, while sincere, obviously involve much larger and more abstract questions about the connections, if any, between aesthetics and morality, about what the adjective in a phrase like the magazine of good living is really supposed to mean. And these questions lead straightaway into such deep and treacherous waters that it's probably best to stop the public discussion right here. There are limits to what even interested persons can ask of each other.
Please keep in mind as we're going forward that I'm not trying to diminish Consider the Lobster on its own merits. The questions that it raises are important ones. It's important to continually evaluate and reevaluate the ethics of how we treat livestock animals, if in fact we even choose to classify certain creatures as such. I think it's absolutely a topic worth discussing. It's just not what I'm trying to discuss here. What I'm more interested in was the way in which Consider the Lobster hooked me, independent of any discourse on the distribution of arthropodic sensory neurons. Personally, I've always had a curious relationship with lobster as a dish. Whenever I'm asked the standard icebreaker question of, what's your favorite food? There's always been a part of me that's a bit cagey about answering completely honestly. See, the tastiest thing that I've ever shoveled into my mouth would be surf and turf, specifically the pairing of filet mignon with lobster tail. But when other people are answering with comfort foods like tacos or pizzas, that answer just seems too bourgeoisie. What I also find interesting is that the self-inflicted compromise that I've come to is to omit the lobster and simply answer steak, which seems subconsciously sufficient. Even with this puzzling existing relationship, I've never been curious enough about how my favorite food wound up on my plate to do any additional research. And I'll be completely honest here, even after having read David Foster Wallace's essay, I was still equally uncompelled as to finding out how the proverbial sausage was made. But I was utterly compelled to finish reading it. And it was at that point, after I'd finished reading and was digesting the above reflections, when I was hit by the final of those 3 cerebral gut shots. This experience was something wholly outside of the type of engagement that I normally experience and value from other artistic mediums. In narrative art, books, movies, games, TV shows, one of the most important feelings to affect in your audience is that of immersion, creating an experience that deeply engages the audience and makes them feel as though they are part of the story being told. But that's not really the case for Consider the Lobster. Hell, it's not even a requirement that the reader be interested in food preparation as a topic. I certainly wasn't. So rather than immersion, I'd instead like to classify this phenomena as invection, the introduction of something from an outside source. And what really struck me about this phenomena is that I'd had it before. And to recount that, we'll have to leave gourmet food aside for a moment and talk about something on the polar opposite side of the perceived sophistication scale. Let's talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! There's not a goddamn segue on the planet that smoothly transitions between those two topics. For those in the audience that need a primer, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a Japanese multimedia franchise of the early 2000s, following a similar business model to the likes of Pokemon. It started life as a manga and then became an anime before eventually finding its true footing as a children's trading card game. Again, kind of like Pokemon. However, one of the interesting differences that set Yu-Gi-Oh! Apart on the playground from the Pokemon TCG was that kids actually bothered to learn how to play the game. Despite all of the TV show's unrelenting attempts to teach you inaccurate rules, down to getting the number of life points that you start with wrong, and even after Duelist Kingdom, when they changed it from being 2,000, they only upped it to 4,000 when it was supposed to be 8,000? Sorry. Anywho, if you're curious as to how the actual game plays, I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Has fairly earned its moniker of baby's first Magic the Gathering, and if you don't know what Magic the Gathering is, well, then I'm sorry, because this is probably going to be a confusing couple of minutes for you. But don't go anywhere, because that's actually going to kind of end up being my point. So, the central conceit of Yu-Gi-Oh's game design, as it has been for many of Magic's challengers, is to circumvent the complicated resource management system that is inherent to the land mechanic. Initially, the trade-off seemed to be using weaker cards themselves as a resource and tribute fodder to fuel your larger and more powerful monsters. That's sorta remained a core part of the game's identity with the ever-prevalent dominance of the extra deck monsters. But it was right around the same time that extra deck monsters were getting huge buffs that the game's other major modern feature took hold, named archetypes. While other card games have had similar mechanics where one or maybe even a handful of cards will reference another card or group of cards by name, I feel pretty confident in saying that none of them have leaned quite as hard on that being central to their game's identity as Yu-Gi-Oh! Did. This ended up having a pretty interesting effect on the ludonarrative role-playing as well. Rather than imagining yourself freely exploring the world of duel monsters, or even as one of the characters therein, the game devs had essentially placed you in a position where you were acting as a coach of a particular group of cards that they had preordained go together. I can't say for certain why this became the principal design philosophy. Playing through it at the time, it almost felt accidental, like they were just stringing together a bunch of legacy support for some of the franchise's flagship monsters until eventually they came to a high enough density to where archetypes just became omnipresent. Regardless of its intentionality, the consequence was enormously powerful board states that one could achieve with relative ease, provided that you were okay with those board states being highly curated. In addition to the game to game impact, the ever increasing focus on and importance of archetypes also exacerbated the already existing problem of power creep. Yu Gi Oh! Has a unique way of determining which cards would be legal in tournament play. From the very first set, there existed restrictions on how many copies of any one card you could put in a deck. Not too long after that, a proper ban list was introduced, which forbade certain cards from being used in tournaments at all based on their individual power level. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Has never restricted any card's legality based on when it was released, as many other long-running card games have. In theory, this means that if you started playing the game in the early 2000s, you could use your old deck with any of the cards that hadn't been individually banned. In practice, this attitude, combined with the archetype-centric design, created the all-too-common scenario where your deck becomes unplayable overnight because a newer archetype gets released that utterly invalidates it. What's worse is that since there's no division of cards legality based on release date, there's also no modern or vintage officially supported alternative formats that are designed to give older cards a home outside of standard tournament play. What I am saying is that archetypes were a gamble, and seeing as how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is still running to this day and printing new cards, there is a fair, if unprovable, argument to be made that it was a necessary gamble to keep the game from dying the oh-so-common death of just another Magic clone. On the other hand, I think there's a fair counter argument to be made that it also caused a lot of players to bounce off the game at a faster rate than they would have otherwise when they suddenly realized that their Madolche deck that they dropped thousands of dollars on suddenly had a worse return on investment than an egotistical ape NFT. Oh, and a quick aside for anyone who knows the game and cares. No, this isn't what caused me to quit playing. Well, not exactly. I was playing a rogue tier Fable deck using their discard to benefit engine to fuel a Brionic into Spring of Rebirth combo for infinite life with an Ancient Sacred Wyvern kicker for an infinite attack if my opponent didn't scoop on the spot. Until Brionic got banned. And well, yes, Brionic, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, isn't part of the fabled archetype, it was still enough to nuke the deck's viability. Stepping back and surveying the aforementioned competitive landscape, it was disheartening enough that I gave up on Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point and started playing Magic. I felt more incentivized learning to play an entirely new game than learning to play a different archetype. And I don't think I'm alone in this camp either. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Is surviving and printing new cards to this very day, if we again compare it to Magic the Gathering, the most recent product lines for Magic have caused a number of very serious business people in the mainstream media to look at the long-term viability of its parent company, Hasbro Inc., based predominantly on their handling of the Magic the Gathering intellectual property. No such credulous ink has been spilled over Konami's economic fate on behalf of the Yu-Gi-Oh! IP. Into this space enter Rada of the YouTube channel Rank 10 Yu-Gi-Oh! See, it's clever because Xyz's monsters use ranks instead of levels, and he started as a listicle channel doing top 10 lists, so he's ranking 10 cards, and yeah, never mind, just trust me, it's clever. Anyway, enter Rada, a Serbian Yugi tuber who, as mentioned, started off his channel doing top 10 lists of various related Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, and Rada immediately established his voice as flippant and cheeky. While he did have a few run-of-the-mill lists, like top 10 monsters of whatever type, there was also a clear focus on some of the more absurd topics. Top 10 weirdest card effects, top 10 hardest monsters to summon that suck anyway, or top 10 worst card names. Out of all of these, it seemed like it was Rada's very first video that loomed in the back of his mind as he moved into his second year of content creation. That initial video being the top 10 worst archetype support cards. This affinity for looking at the subpar aspects of archetype design eventually evolved into its own long-running series, Legacy of the Worthless, which, well, I'll just let Rada describe it himself.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Rank 10 Yu-Gi-Oh's Legacy of the Worthless! If you aren't familiar yet, in this series we're looking at the most infuriatingly unplayable archetypes ever shut out by Konami's executive asshole, what exactly makes those archetypes so horrible, and what needs to be improved in order for them to be less awful.
Yeah, it's a pretty succinct summary. That ended up being the secret to the formula. This novel approach to reviewing the card game ended up doing gangbusters for Rada's views. As Legacy of the Worthless continued, you could see a steady incline in viewership of that series versus the other hit-and-miss content that he would also periodically upload. There was only one issue. Konami, being a business, didn't have an intrinsic interest in losing money. This means the actual scope of Legacy of the Worthless was always going to be predetermined by the dearth of existing garbage to review, capping out Rada's series at a mere 32.5 episodes. It was in that series finale, covering the laughably weak Guardian monsters, where Rada came to a curious epiphany.
Let's be honest, who even cares at this point? I'm just gonna say the shit I say in every episode. Give him a field spell, give him back roll, more support, give him a zipper zapper, a clipper clapper, it's pointless. And you know what? In that same vein, this entire series might have been pointless too. When you think about it, Legacy of the Worthless is nothing more than an overblown finger-pointing fiesta in which a simple ha-ha was replaced by 20 to 30 minute videos of which one was embarrassingly wrong and a waste of everyone's time. But if so, why are there so many people excited about it? Why do people who don't even play Yu-Gi-Oh watch it? Is it possible that all of these fellows that have gathered here means that the real Legacy of the Worthless was the friends we made along the way? Okay, no. I know exactly why everyone's here. You wanna...
let them fight.
Yeah, I can get behind that idea. Let's let them fight.
And, well, no. At the end of the day, War of the Worthless turned out pretty fine-ish. I'll be honest, at this point I was really starting to feel my period of absence from the game. Even watching these preeminently awful decks, some of which even debuted when I was playing, being wielded under the game's newest rules and mechanics kinda lost me. Plus, Rada barely narrated, mostly just adding very sparse between-match comments every 15 minutes or so. Look, War of the Worthless certainly wasn't worthless, or even really that bad. But I do think that it represents a misattribution of the primary reason why the audience was there in the first place. See, it's always been this line in particular that stuck out to me from the Guardians video.
Why do people who don't even play Yu-Gi-Oh watch it?
My brother in Christ, you made the content. We are here first and foremost to see you. Like, if the question being posited is, why do so many people who don't play this game watch my content? It seems like you're going to have a much higher correlation between that and they like my content than they want to see this game played in a wholly unique way. If you did enjoy the War of the Worthless tournament, then the last thing that I'm trying to do is take that enjoyment away from you. Just the opposite, in fact. It's my belief that what Rada keyed into, his fostering engagement for a super esoteric topic that part of his audience never even had a previous relationship with, was in fact the flourishing of the desire for invection in today's modern audience. Not the birth of this concept, mind, but certainly a compelling indicator for a culminating moment of what the public was hungry for in this era of interpersonal informational entertainment. I've seen the term video essay cropping up increasingly in usage over the past few years, and I find this an especially prescient codification from my personal perspective, given that the earliest made material I've experienced this vicarious enthusiasm was from David Foster Wallace's essay considering the plight of the forlorn lobster. And what's most convinced me that invection is an artistic metric and one whose value is on the rise is precisely that disconnect between Rada's audience's familiarization with the topics he's covering and their engagement with his content regardless. And it seems like time has borne that out. Rada continued to find success in iterating on the Legacy of the Worthless format, but this time with archetypes actually worthy of praise and consideration, naming this new show Archetype Archive, and so things went. For a while. Until one day,
Wanna see a video game live up to its title?
Out of nowhere, Rada drops an hour-long review of the brand new early access boomer shooter Ultra Kill, a complete and total departure from anything even remotely Yu-Gi-Oh related, not just in terms of the game mechanics, but even Rada's voice sounded reinvigorated, electrified by the experience.
After finding all 4 buttons in limbo, you finally receive your reward. Oh, that's the sound of success!
I'm not saying that Rada was disillusioned with Archetype Archive. I mean, maybe. He never said as much, and guessing at his motivations feels disrespectfully presumptuous. What I am saying is that him having taken a risk like this, knowing that it was so against his established brand, just because he was galvanized by this game and wanted to share that with his audience, that feeling is palpable, tangible, infectious. And checking the stats on the Ultra Kill review on Reddit's channel, bam! Second most watched video he's ever made. Which is not to say that popularity is an objective measure of quality, or that I've figured out the one weird trick to becoming successful on YouTube. Slife or strike me down if I ever try to sell myself as some kind of content creator guru. Blech. Nah, the point is that Rada had cultivated an audience around the very specific topic of Yu-Gi-Oh! But when he took a chance, swung for the fences, and produced content on a new subject that he was genuinely excited about and wasn't trying to min-max his SEO, it didn't alienate his audience. They were just stoked to see him stoked.
There is no joke here. That's just the best build-up to a boss fight I've ever experienced in my life.
Another anecdote. This one actually comes from my wife, who loves to scrapbook, which that doesn't need nearly as much preamble as Yu-Gi-Oh does, right? Like, even if you don't know the ins and outs of scrapbooking, it's not that hard of a baseline to grok. It's a photo album that you add memorabilia and other related crafts to so that it's more fun. Good? Good. So my wife's into it, and she likes to watch a couple of scrapbooking YouTubers. One of them is named Shamel Lane. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to extrapolate out comparisons and discrepancies between Shamel and other scrapbooking YouTubers, because I'm woefully unqualified to be able to do so. Instead, it was my wife watching one of Shamel's scrapbooking streams when she noticed a funny little detail that she thought to share with me, as it related quite neatly to Invection as I described it to her. Best I can understand it, Shamel cares not just about her audience being able to learn scrapbooking techniques from her, but also that the viewers are actually using all the cool crafting materials that they've accrued over the years, known in the scrapbooking community as one's stash. To better gauge her audience's existing habits, Shamel sent out a survey that asked how often viewers drew from their stash when scrapbooking, with the none of the above answer jokingly phrased as have never scrapbooked and have no plans to start scrapbooking. Because, like, obviously, who would be watching a scrapbooking channel that didn't even scrap?
And it came to my attention over the last few months that there are far more of you who watch that don't scrapbook than I ever would have thought. So there are some people who just come along for the crafty fun and have never made a scrapbook page. If that's you, maybe 2023 is the year that you stick some paper to other paper in an aesthetically pleasing way and make a scrapbook page. That would make my year. So yes, whether you scrapbook, whether you don't, you're welcome here. We're all good, and we just love color and paper and pattern and layering and having fun.
Sounds kind of familiar, no? And just as I was about to finalize this script, notable YouTuber, music critic, and silhouette Todd in the Shadows released his review of the controversial country music star Morgan Wallen, in which Todd noted this.
Now, I know a lot of you don't care about country music, or music at all. I know for some of you, I'm your only source of any music news. Don't know how that happened, but okay.
When I finally decided that I wanted to toss my hat into the ever-churning maelstrom of takes that is YouTube, I had a cornucopia of potential video ideas to develop as a first foot forward. This one became the most obvious lead-off for a couple of reasons. First, it's easily the most self-aggrandizing. I mean, I just spent the last however the hell long arguing for the intrinsic artistic value of infection via video essay in a video essay. But secondly, I wanted to put forth something akin to a thesis statement on this whole bonkers second or even third hand engagement with art thing that is the video essay scene. Namely, that I'm all for it. I have no idea what the far future of this channel holds, and I am sure I will make plenty of mistakes along the way. I may have even made some in this inaugural video. I have plenty of introspective growth to still undergo, and a nigh infinite amount to learn. But the thing that I believe in first and foremost is discourse. My main goal here is just to keep the conversation going, because it was that final paragraph of Consider the Lobster that really got its claws in me.
Sincere obviously involve much larger and more abstract questions about the connections, if any, between aesthetics and morality, about what the adjective in a phrase like the magazine of good living is really supposed to mean, and these questions lead straightaway into such deep and treacherous waters that it's probably best to stop the public discussion right here. There are limits to what even interested persons can ask of each other.
And once again, I'm inclined to disagree. The more time that I spend on this wacky platform, the more I feel like there isn't even a limit to what you can ask a disinterested person to at least consider.